Okay, hello. I'm going to go over some of the guidelines for the personal essay revision. So the actual due date for that's going to be on Moodle, and I was going to talk about what I expect out of the final revision of the personal essay, the nonfiction, creative nonfiction. So this is 18% of your grade, and you've already got a draft of it. Everybody in the class has written the draft. Now all you have to do is revise it, improve it, and I want to talk about what that looks like on how to improve your draft and what I'm going to be grading on. So the first thing you want to know is when you turn it in, you want to turn in your workshop draft that I've marked up, your final draft that is polished and ready to show other people, and then a copy of the letter of feedback that I gave you or I emailed you. So make sure you include that in a folder. And so again, I'll give you the due date in class about that, but for now I'll talk about what it needs to look like and how I'm going to be grading it. One of the first things we talked about in class was characterization, setting, conflict, and resolution. And as you know, whenever you write an essay, you need to have characterization and setting right off the bat, so the reader understands where they're at, which characters they need to pay attention to, and what city they're in, what kind of culture is this story taking place in, and whatnot. And I'll be looking for that. So make sure that you establish your friends that you're talking about, since you're talking about your life, and establish who these people are. As the story you might want to jump in the story, but make sure you establish those. If you don't have those established, I'll be taking points off. And as you know, if you don't have characterization, it's hard for the reader to follow you or really get to know the people. Okay. So we talked about that in class. The other thing would be conflict. And so make sure that your story has a conflict. When it has that conflict or something that needs to be resolved, it helps the reader to have some suspense that they want to understand, or they want to know what's going to happen. How will this conflict be resolved? So in the John Williams story, you might remember what we're kind of waiting to see is whether his friend's going to jump off the cliff into the water, and then also what happens to his friend. Does his friend hit the water and drown, or does his friend survive? So we don't really know, and part of the reason that story was successful because he doesn't tell us, okay? Which we're going to talk about he tells us at the end, but we're going to talk about that later, how to build suspense. Another thing is which is something that I've had a hard time learning myself over the years when I write a nonfiction essay, is how do you organize it to make it cohesive? And one way there's two ways I've asked you to do this. Either do it by time or theme. You can do both, really. So you either have a story that is focused on one day or a set of 72 hours. Any more than that, it gets a little bit complicated, considering this essay is maybe max about 12 pages, 12 to 15 pages max. So since you don't have a lot of time, you can't really go into like multiple weeks necessarily. So the advantage of having a time, it helps us to focus and understand chronological scenes that are happening in a story. So John Williams is like that. We see his friends going to jump off the cliff, and then they jump off the cliff. We see Richard Seltzer. It's over a month with the little girl, Imelda, and the doctor. So those are some good examples of how they're focused on time. So I will be looking for time, or a organizing principle is like what I like to call it. Again, this is sometimes hard because when we're telling a story, we kind of jump around. Our brains just jump around. And it sometimes takes a couple of edits to make sure your story is clear to the audience and the reader. Another thing you can do, which is more like Joan Didion's essay is more of a reflection of like her time in New York City. So it's about the theme would be about her kind of losing her innocence as a person and then having to grow up and be an adult, and what kind of the cost of that. So the theme could be something, if your story was, you couldn't fit it all in 72 hours, you can focus on that theme, have that theme tie everything together. So you want either like time to tie everything together or a theme to tie everything together. Also, make sure that whenever you are writing, again, this is hard to do sometimes, but to create a scene. So if you have your character or yourself and you are in a classroom with other students, you want to create that scene so the reader can see it. If you are, like for me, when the story that I shared with you that I wrote, if you're at a funeral home, you want to make sure that the reader gets a sense of who's there, what is happening, so they see the scene. Okay, and that is, like I said, sometimes when we write, we just want to get through certain parts, but we got to slow down and establish the scene. So if I change and I go, like in my story, I go from a funeral home to a parking lot in a high school parking lot, I have to change and to take the reader there and make sure they're following me. Okay, so if I actually wrote a road trip story one time, and one of the weaknesses of the road trip story, it was like 60 pages, is that we were moving the whole time. So it was hard for the reader to really see what does LA look like or what does San Francisco look like. So it was hard sometimes to, it was kind of just a weakness in my essay that I didn't have one image for the reader to focus on. One other thing I wanted to mention is try to think about, as the textbook says, some self-discovery or some self-exploration. So that would just be a paragraph, a reflection, maybe in the middle of the essay or at the end of the essay. You don't want to have it at the beginning because you're establishing all these other things, but have it just a paragraph telling us, really, again, why are you telling this story? It's almost to kind of remind yourself why you're telling it, and then also, or maybe at the end, you can have a reflection paragraph, say, why is it that you told the story? Again, maybe what you learned. I had a student last semester, I mentioned this in class, that she was a vegan, and she talks about how she became a vegan. But then the essay has an interesting turn because she talks about how she found out she was kind of self-righteous about her vegan beliefs and how she kind of changes. Okay, so that is what she kind of realizes later. And she says that, and I pushed her whenever we were editing her essay for her to talk specifically about this is when I realized I was being a jerk about being a vegan. So think about why is it that you're telling your story, and sometimes just say that near the end. You don't say that necessarily at the beginning, but kind of reflect on it in the middle of the essay or near the end of the essay. Or give hints. Okay. Your essay also needs to kind of have some kind of like finality to it, where you're coming to a conclusion about what this all means. And so a personal essay is not necessarily a chapter of a book, but you want to have some, as much as you can, ready for others to understand, again, why you're telling the story and what it means. And a good way to judge this is, are you happy with it? And if you're not happy with what you said here, you might ask me what else do I need to have to push this forward, because a lot of times we write, we know it's just not right. This has nothing to do, no less to do with grammar, but like content. Okay, so one other thing is I've assigned you William Zinsser to read. William Zinsser, his book on writing well, it's amazing. It's it's the best book I've ever read on writing, how to edit and make things connect with the audience. So if you read, and I've copied some of the chapters, and I've posted that on Moodle, and that's one of the homework assignments. So William Zinsser's On Writing Well, I'll put some chapters on Moodle, read that, and you'll get a lot of tips on how to be concise, how to not waste the reader's time, how to understand that writing is hard. He talks about that, how writing is hard. It's not something that just flows out naturally. You have to work and get the sentences just right. And that can be freeing sometimes whenever you realize, wow, this is not just something that, I drink a coffee and I smoke a cigarette and I'm a writer and I feel good and all of a sudden I'm inspired to write something awesome. So you have to work, and it's sometimes grueling. So he talks about that, and that's really refreshing. So one last thing, I want to, second half of this, I want to talk a little bit about Mark Twain. And so I gave you guys a story or an essay by Twain. It's called How to Tell a Story. So again, this is one of my favorite essays, because he talks about how to tell a story, and he's talking about how to tell it orally, like with your friends. Before I talk about that, I was going to talk about how my mom used to tell me a story when I was a kid. And when I was a kid, she would say, she had this sort of template for telling me stories as a kid, and I think it's effective. It's a story template. So it would typically go like this. One time there was a crew of men doing construction. The men were digging a big hole in order to build a house. And they had to build the basement, and all houses have basements. And one day a man fell in the hole, and they couldn't get him out. So they said, what are we going to do? We can't get the man out. And so they were panicking. They said, we'll call Nathan. And so this is the bedtime story. So I'm right there laying in bed, and she's telling me these stories before I go to bed. So it was this, I was always the hero. So it was funny because it was funny just because my mom described it. Nathan got a backhoe and dug the man out of the hole, which is kind of funny because if you got a backhoe and dug a man out, you probably would hit him in the face or hurt him, injure him or something. So anyways, if you took the template, it would be like, there's an unsolvable problem. What do we do about it? And then I'm the hero. So that's one good way to tell a story to a kid, to where they're the hero. And there was another time, same thing. She would do the same technique. Somebody was cooking and they forgot to turn the stove off, so it caught on fire, and there was and the whole building caught on fire. And all these people were panicking because they couldn't get this kid out of the top window of the apartment building. And so they were confused, and they said, what are we going to do? No, who's going to save the little boy up in the top window? He's looking out, and we have a fire truck, but we can't get him out. So they said, we know what we'll do. We'll call Nathan. And so my mom described it that I showed up as the hero. I was a firefighter, and I ran up the steps, got the boy, and ran down the steps. So again, I'm the hero of the story. So it's a simple story, but the point of the story is sometimes if we use these sort of templates, we can think about how to tell a story, even to, that's for kids, but in the same way, stories work in a similar way, these kind of templates or tips on how to write. So for Mark Twain, I like this story a lot, or this essay a lot, because it talks to you about how to create suspense. So if you're reading this, you're maybe thinking, what's the lesson here? So I want to talk a little bit about the background of this. So how to tell a story. He just has, in my own words here, the 4 things you want to remember about this. He says, don't tell people your story is funny. Show that it is funny, sad, interesting, or deep. You're not going to announce the beginning of your personal narrative, personal essay, or your fiction story. When you get into fiction, don't tell the reader how to feel about whatever they're reading. You want to show them in the first 2 or 3 pages, and then later save that thing till the end. He says to ramble some if you like in order to show detail. He says to keep a straight face. And then he says save the best line, what he calls a snapper, till the end. So these are kind of the main 4 points that he makes in this essay. And these are, again, for storytelling, almost like for a comedian. A comedian could use these points. But I want to talk about how to translate to nonfiction. So he says, first of all, if you think back to Allison Daniels, she wrote the essay that we read in class about going to Africa. She could have started her essay off like, this is just going to be a story about the one time whenever I went to Africa and I almost saw somebody get shot in the head. So if she said that in the first page, you wouldn't want to read the rest of the essay. You would just be like, oh, I know what's going to happen. Okay, well, what else do you have? Is there anything else? It's not as interesting. But she keeps that to herself as a writer, and we read the whole thing, and we're more interested and captivated by what she's talking about. So Twain says that you should, don't announce what you're going to talk about right at the beginning. You want to have the reader sort of discover it with you, okay? And I'm guilty of this as a storyteller. Whenever I tell a story, I want people to listen to what I'm going to say. So I want to say, hey, I got a funny story I want to tell you about, the time that I almost died in Peru, So that actually happened, but it would be better if I said one time I was in Peru and this started to happen, and I kind of build up to that. So to make it more suspense, if you want suspense, you want to kind of hold certain things back, but maybe give little tips in your story, whether that's nonfiction or fiction. Twain says it like this. He says, the humorous story is told gravely. The teller does his best to conceal the fact that he is even dimly suspect that there is anything funny about it, but the teller of the comic story, and the comic story is what he considers to be the terrible way to tell a story, tells you beforehand that this is one of the funniest things he's ever heard. Then he tells it with eager delight and the first person to laugh, and he is the first person to laugh when he gets through. So he compares the humorous story to the comic story. The comic story is what he considers to be a European way of telling a story. I don't know if he doesn't like Europeans or something, but he just makes fun of Europeans and the way they tell stories. And then there's the humorous story. He calls that an American way. And he says the American way, you keep a straight face when you tell the story and you pretend like you don't think there's anything interesting about it. So in the same way, I think when you write, it's the same way. You try to, just write and without announcing to the reader what's going to happen. And this is just a tip that he says in this that I thought was interesting. He says, whenever you tell a story, you don't smile, you don't laugh at your own story. You just tell the story and then let the audience react. He believes this makes it more entertaining to listen to, as opposed to you laughing at yourself. And then this is what he says about it. But the teller of the comic story does not slur the nub. He shouts it at you every time, and he prints it in England, France, Germany, and Italy, and he italicizes, puts some whooping exclamation point after it, and sometimes explains it in parentheses, all of which is depressing and makes one want to renounce joking and lead a better life. So this is about telling a joke, and he says that if you're going to tell a joke, don't hit people over the head with it over and over and over, and you want to be subtle about it. Okay, so in the same way, whenever you're telling your story, that's something to keep in mind. He also says something I want to point out. Sometimes it's okay to get off topic and to sort of ramble a little bit before you get to your main point or the punchline or the most interesting thing that happens in your story. And it's okay to ramble a little bit. And here's why. He says the humorous story may be spun out to great length and may wander around as much as it pleases and arrive at nowhere in particular, but the comic and the witty stories must be brief and end with a point. The humorous story bubbles gently along, the others burst. So again, he's suggesting that, I assume, because sometimes when you ramble a little bit, get a little bit off topic, but you're still going somewhere, you allow the reader to understand your life a little bit more. Another quote, he says, to string incongruities and absurdities together in a wandering, sometimes purposeless way and seem innocently unaware that they are absurdities is the basis of American art. If my position is correct, another feature is the slurring of the point. And so he talks about how sometimes it's okay to make your story a little bit, ramble a little bit, as long as it comes to that main point. And then at the end, he says, save that surprise for last, and that's whenever you read in the essay, he tells the story of the golden arm, and he talks about how the man telling the story really focuses on that punchline. So in the same way, you might be telling a funny story about your life, and so you might have a punchline. So think about how you deliver it. So the purpose of this is that I think these few tips help to think us how our techniques about how to tell a story that has happened to us and make sometimes really normal things sometimes funny if you tell it in this way. Some people might think this is manipulation. I think what you're really doing is you are helping the reader experience it with you, because you don't know when you're in that moment what's going to happen at the end. It maybe ends up to be really funny in the end, but in the moment you're probably scared or nervous, or you have anxiety, or you're excited, all these different emotions. So to have the reader sort of experience it with you is a very good thing. You want the reader to experience those things with you. Okay. So all that to say, that's kind of the reason I'm having you read the Twain. It's not that long. Again, the Golden Arm is just an example. It is also in Twain's typical. He writes like how people speak, so it's in dialect, and sometimes you have to read it out loud to understand really what the person's saying. So just know that. And I just wanted to mention a few of those things about Twain's. I think this is telling a good story is a lost art. People orally or on paper, if you know how to tell a story, it's going to help everybody communicate better. So read this not only for your writing skills, but also for your communication skills. So overall, I just wanted to touch on a few things related to Twain and the structure of the story, and then also your final draft. And those are the main points that I want you to think about whenever you're editing your essay. One last thing I just remembered that I forgot about editing your essay is that how I'm going to grade it. So I mentioned almost everything, but the last thing is I do want to see a change from your first draft to your final draft. So I do want you to make some changes to where I can see you've improved it, thinking about new and creative ways to connect with your audience. At this point, you want to think about how can I connect with my audience. Maybe at this point you've got all the stuff you want to say, but you want to think about how can you connect this to the reader. How does the reader connect with you, and how can you enhance this story? Not fabricate anything, but enhance this story so the reader experiences it more fully. So that might mean adding 2 more pages of more characterization or setting, things like that. So I do want to see a advanced copy. So overall, I'm really looking forward to seeing y'all's final drafts, and I hope this reflection on Twain helps you. Okay? Y'all have a good day, and I'll talk to y'all later.